Welcome back to Horror Galaxy. Tonight, I have 5 untold, disturbing, true Oregon small-town horror stories for you. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because once you step onto the Horror Galaxy, you don't walk alone. I was dragging the last trash bin down the hallway when the bell rang again, sharp and clean. The exact same sound it always made at the end of the day, and I froze with my hand still wrapped around the rim. I remember saying out loud, "That's not funny," even though there was nobody there to hear it, and the words came out shaky. I had already locked the main doors. I knew I had, because I always counted the clicks in my head, one for each entrance. A habit I picked up after losing my keys once and spending an hour panicking in the dark. I stood there listening, my heart thudding hard enough that it felt like it was pushing against my ribs, waiting to hear footsteps or laughter or anything that would explain why the final bell had gone off again. I checked my watch, more out of instinct than logic. My shift was almost over. The building should have been dead quiet by now, the kind of quiet that makes your own breathing sound rude. I pushed the trash bin the rest of the way to the janitor's closet and shut it inside, trying to convince myself that maybe I'd messed up the schedule or the system had glitched. Old wiring, old timers. That's what I told myself. Still, my skin felt tight, like it does when you know something isn't right, but you can't yet say why. I walked toward the office, my shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum. As I passed the classrooms, I glanced through the small windows in the doors, even though I knew what I'd see. Empty desks, chalkboards wiped clean, coats gone from hooks, everything in its place. The bell system was controlled from the main office, and if it had rung, someone or something had triggered it. That thought made my stomach twist. I hadn't seen a single person since the last teacher left almost an hour earlier. I knew their faces, knew their routines. This wasn't a place where strangers wandered in unnoticed. The office lights were still on, which wasn't unusual. I always left them for last. I stepped inside and went straight to the attendance desk, because that's where the bell controls were mounted on the wall behind it. The panel looked the same as always, a mess of switches and labels faded from years of fingers brushing over them. None of the switches were flipped. The timer dial sat exactly where it should have been, already past the last scheduled ring. I touched it anyway, half expecting it to be warm or vibrating or something that would make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't. That's when I noticed the ledger. The attendance log sat open on the desk, even though I was sure I'd closed it earlier. I frowned and leaned closer. The pages were filled, neat rows of names and dates written in blue ink. At first, nothing looked out of place. Then, I saw the newest entry at the bottom of the page, the ink darker, fresher. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes as I read the name. It belonged to a boy who had drowned in the river years before I ever took this job. I knew that because I'd been living here long enough to remember the funeral procession passing by my house. I flipped the page with trembling fingers. More names. More dates. All of them familiar in a distant, uncomfortable way. A girl who had died in a car accident on the highway. A boy who had taken his own life in the woods behind his parents' farm. I felt cold all over, the kind of cold that doesn't come from the air. These weren't current students. They weren't even recent. They were kids who should have been adults by now, or older than me if they'd lived. I sat down hard in the chair behind the desk, my legs suddenly weak. My first thought was that someone was playing a sick joke, but that didn't hold up. Who would know these names, these details? Who would break in just to write them down and ring a bell? I reached for the phone on the desk, thinking I'd call the principal or the police, but my hand hovered there, unsure. What was I going to say? That the school was haunted? That the attendance book was filling itself? Before I could decide, the bell rang again, closer this time, as if it were inside my head. I jumped, nearly knocking the phone to the floor. The sound echoed down the hall, and with it came something else, a low murmur. Voices. At first, they were too faint to make out, just a layered whisper that crawled along my nerves. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor louder than I wanted it to. The murmuring grew clearer as I stepped into the hallway, resolving into the unmistakable sound of students talking between classes. I told myself it was impossible even as I heard it. I walked toward the nearest classroom, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. The door was closed. I put my hand on the knob and hesitated, my mind racing through every explanation that didn't involve what I was afraid of. Then I turned it and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The desks were still, the air still. No students. No voices. The murmuring stopped the moment the door opened, leaving a silence that felt heavy and deliberate. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the rows of chairs, my breath coming fast and shallow. When I backed out and closed the door, the voices started again, further down the hall now, like they were moving away from me. I followed them, my feet carrying me forward even as every instinct screamed to leave. I needed to understand what was happening. The voices led me past the gym, past the science wing, toward the old classrooms at the far end of the building. Those rooms hadn't been used in years. They were scheduled for renovation or demolition, depending on who you asked. I rarely went down there. The lights were dimmer, some of them flickering, and the smell of dust and old paper hung in the air. The voices stopped outside one of the classrooms, and I stopped with them. The door was ajar. I pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. The room looked different from the others. The desks were occupied. Students sat in their seats, heads bent, hands folded or fidgeting. My stomach dropped as I recognized faces from old yearbooks I'd seen in the storage room. Faces that hadn't changed since the day they died. They didn't look at me. They stared straight ahead, as if waiting for something. At the front of the room, the chalkboard was filled with names. More names than I'd seen in the ledger. I took a step back, my heel catching on the threshold. The sound drew their attention. Every head turned toward me in perfect unison, and I felt a wave of pressure hit me, like standing too close to a loudspeaker. Their eyes weren't empty or glowing or anything dramatic. They were just tired, sad, expectant. One of them stood up. It was the boy from the river. He looked older than he had in the photos, like time had continued for him in some uneven way. He opened his mouth, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and polite. "You're late," he said. I shook my head, backing toward the door. "I don't work here like that," I said, though even as I spoke, I realized how weak it sounded. "I just clean up." "That's why you can hear us," he replied. "You stay after." I wanted to run. Instead, I asked the question that had been burning in me since the first bell rang. "What do you want?" He glanced at the board, then back at me. "Attendance," he said. We were never marked present. The weight of that settled over me slowly, horribly. I thought of the ledger, of the names filling the pages. "You're not supposed to be here," I whispered. "We know," he said. "We just don't know where else to go." The bell rang again, louder than ever, and the students began to fade, their outlines blurring like chalk smudged by a careless hand. I squeezed my eyes shut and screamed, the sound tearing out of me before I could stop it. When I opened them, the room was empty. The chalkboard was clean. The lights were steady. I stood there shaking, my throat raw, my mind spinning. I don't remember walking back to the office, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was sitting at the desk again, staring at the ledger. The pages were full now. Every name from the board was there, neatly written, dated that very night. At the bottom of the last page was a blank line, waiting. I closed the book with a snap and stood up. I didn't finish my shift. I didn't lock the doors behind me. I just left. The next day, I turned in my keys. I told them I couldn't do it anymore, that the night work was getting to me. They didn't argue. Maybe they saw something in my face. Maybe they were relieved. I moved away not long after, putting miles between me and that building, between me and those voices. Years passed. I built a life. I tried not to think about that night. It almost worked. Then, last week, I ran into an old co-worker who still lived there. We talked about nothing for a while. The weather, the town, the way it always seems to stay the same. As we were parting, he mentioned that the school had finally been renovated, the old wing torn down and replaced. They found something weird, though, he said casually. Old attendance books, hidden in a wall, all filled out. Names nobody remembered. I felt that familiar pressure behind my eyes. Did they find them all? I asked. He frowned. What do you mean, the names? I said. Did they find all the names? He shrugged. I guess so. Why? I didn't answer. I just said goodbye and walked away, my heart pounding, listening in my head for a bell that, so far, hasn't rung again. I was standing by the funnel cake trailer when I realized my sister was late, the paper tray warm in my hands and sugar sticking to my fingers, and that feeling hit me all at once like missing a step on stairs. She had said she was going to the animal barn and would be back before the fireworks test, and I remember checking the cheap plastic watch Dad bought me and thinking she should have been there already, because she never broke promises to me, not once. I scanned the crowd, faces blurring together, and felt that sharp kid panic where you don't know if you're about to get in trouble or if something worse is happening. I started walking fast, pushing past people, calling her name louder than I meant to. I remember feeling stupid because my voice cracked, and some adults looked at me like I was lost. I wasn't lost. She was. I went past the barn, past the rides, past the game booths, and everywhere smelled like grease and animals and dust. I checked the place she said she'd be, then the place she might have gone instead. I kept telling myself she was just messing with me, that she'd jump out and scare me, because she liked doing that. But after a while, the thought stopped working. I found Mom near the main stage, and I didn't even get the words out right. I just said she was gone, and Mom's face changed in a way I still see when I close my eyes. She grabbed my shoulders too tight and asked when I'd seen her last, and I told her, and she nodded like she was already counting backwards. Dad came over, then one of the fair volunteers, then a sheriff's deputy with a badge that flashed under the lights. People started looking at us like we were part of the entertainment. They took us to a small office behind the ticket booths, and it smelled like old coffee and sweat. They asked me questions I didn't know how to answer, like what she was wearing exactly, and I tried to remember every detail because it felt important, like a test I could fail. Mom cried quietly into a napkin. Dad didn't say much. He just kept rubbing his forehead like there was something stuck there. They searched the fairgrounds. They shut down exits. They made announcements over the loudspeaker, mispronouncing her name. I waited on a folding chair, my legs swinging, feeling useless. Every time the door opened, I expected it to be her, annoyed, asking why everyone was making such a big deal. But it was never her. After a while, the deputy came back and said they needed to look at the security tapes. I didn't know there were cameras at the fair. That idea alone made everything feel different, like the fair wasn't just a place anymore, but a thing that watched you. They didn't want me to come, but Mom insisted, and no one argued with her at that point. The room with the monitors was darker, and the screens showed different angles of the fairgrounds in grainy colors. A man rewound footage, fast-forwarded, paused. He asked me to point her out if I saw her. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I saw her. She was walking near the barn, just like she said she would, and I felt relief so strong it almost hurt. The man kept playing the tape. We watched her walk toward an exit. The timestamp showed a time I recognized. That was when she should have been coming back to me. The deputy frowned. He rewound it and played it again. Then he fast-forwarded. She walked out again. I said that out loud before I could stop myself. The man paused the tape. My sister was on the screen again, same clothes, same walk, heading toward the same exit. The timestamp was later. I remember thinking it had to be a mistake, like the tape was looping or something. But the man shook his head slowly. They kept watching. She exited again. And again. Each time, the timestamp jumped forward. Hours passed on the screen, but she kept leaving the fairgrounds, always alone, always the same way. She never came back in on camera. She just kept leaving. Mom started breathing weird, like she couldn't get enough air. Dad asked if the cameras were messed up. The man said no. The deputy asked if she had a twin. I wanted to scream at him. I knew my sister. I knew the way she walked, the way she swung her arms. That was her. They stopped the tape and rewound to the last time. The timestamp was well after the fair had officially closed for the night. The deputy said that was impossible. He said she'd been reported missing before then. He said there were officers at the exits by that time. No one had seen her. They told us to go home. They said they'd keep looking. I didn't understand how they could tell us that, like we could just leave her there. But we did. The drive home was quiet, except for Mom crying softly. I stared out the window and tried to picture my sister walking home on her own, but every time I did, the image felt wrong, like forcing a puzzle piece. The next day, people came to the house. Neighbors, church people, deputies. They asked the same questions again. I answered them again. Every time I said her name, it felt heavier. That afternoon, a deputy asked if I wanted to see the tape again. He said sometimes details mattered. I said yes before anyone else could answer. They set up a small television in the living room and played the footage. This time, it was slower. I noticed things I hadn't before, like how she never looked around when she exited, never hesitated. She just walked straight ahead, like she knew exactly where she was going. I noticed that sometimes, in the background, people would turn their heads as she passed, but they never stopped her. Then I noticed something else. The timestamp didn't just move forward evenly. Sometimes it jumped by a few minutes. Sometimes by more. It was like the camera didn't care about time the way people did. I asked if they had footage from outside the fairgrounds. The deputy said no, not really. I asked how she could leave so many times without anyone seeing her. He didn't answer that. He just said sometimes tapes did strange things. That night, I dreamed I was standing at the fair exit, watching my sister walk past me over and over. She never looked at me. She just kept walking, and every time she passed, she looked a little more tired. Days passed, then weeks. They searched fields. They searched buildings. They put her picture on flyers. People started saying words like closure and acceptance around us. I hated those words. I wanted answers. One afternoon, I was alone in the living room when the phone rang. I answered it because no one else was home. The voice on the other end asked for my sister by name. I said she wasn't there. The voice paused, then said, confused, that they had just seen her walking down the road by the fairgrounds. I told the deputy. He said people made mistakes. I said they knew her name. He said that didn't mean anything. I stopped telling them things after that. Years went by. I grew up. We moved away, but the tapes followed me in my head. When I was old enough, I went back and asked for the footage. They said it was archived. They said it might be damaged. They said a lot of things. Eventually, I got to see it again. This time, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the last exit, just before she left the frame, she turned her head slightly. Just enough. And for a second, I could see her face. She was looking straight at the camera. And she was crying. The timestamp froze right after that. The tape ended. There was nothing after. No more exits. No more anything. Just static. I asked what that meant. No one answered. They shut the television off. I went outside and sat on the steps, feeling like the ground wasn't solid anymore. Now, years later, I still think about that night. I think about how she kept leaving, like the fair couldn't hold her, like it was letting her go over and over. I think about how no one ever saw her come back. I don't go to fairs anymore. I don't like places with exits that don't lead anywhere. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I think about that last look she gave the camera, and I wonder if she was trying to tell someone she was still there, walking out, again and again, waiting for someone to notice before it was too late. I was reaching for the radio knob with one hand and the steering wheel with the other when my own voice came through the speakers, breathless and shaking, saying my name like I was trying not to forget it. I jerked my hand back as if the dashboard had burned me and nearly drifted into the opposite lane. The truck shuddered, tires humming, and my heart slammed so hard I thought I might black out. The voice on the radio was unmistakably mine, down to the slight whistle in my nose when I panic, and it was begging someone to send help to a stretch of road I had not reached yet. I pulled over without thinking, gravel crunching under the tires, engine still running. The radio kept going. I could hear wind roaring in the background of the broadcast, the same way it does when I crack the window while driving fast. My voice was strained, clipped, the way it gets when I'm trying to stay calm for someone else. I slapped the power button and the sound cut off mid-sentence, leaving a ringing silence that made my ears ache. I sat there gripping the wheel, staring at my hands until the shaking slowed. I told myself it was a coincidence, some idiot with a similar voice calling into a late-night show. I told myself I was tired, that driving deliveries after midnight does things to your head. Then the radio turned itself back on. The same voice, my voice, came back, louder now, clearer, describing a truck losing control near a curve marked by a leaning mile sign. I knew that sign. I drove past it every night. The broadcast ended with metal screaming against metal and a wet, choking sound that made my stomach flip. Then the host came on, calm and professional, thanking the caller for sharing his experience and saying it was a reminder to drive safe out there. I shut off the engine this time and yanked the keys out, like that could stop what was happening. The silence felt wrong, too thick, like it was pressing in on me. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel and tried to breathe. I kept thinking about how the voice on the radio had said my name, my full name, the way only my mother uses it when she is scared. I got back on the road because standing still felt worse. The deliveries were stacked in the back, time sensitive, and I told myself finishing the route would bring things back to normal. I turned the radio off completely and drove with nothing but the sound of the engine and my own breathing. Every few minutes, my eyes flicked to the clock on the dash, watching the minutes crawl, expecting something to line up with what I had heard. Nothing did at first. At the next stop, I carried the boxes inside, signed the receipt, made small talk like my insides were not twisting. When I got back in the truck, the radio was on again, tuned to the same station. I had not touched it. The host was introducing another segment, talking about strange calls and stories from the road. My skin prickled. I turned the volume down low, enough to hear but not enough to feel trapped by it. The next call was a woman crying about seeing headlights behind her that never belonged to a car. I almost laughed with relief when her voice was nothing like mine. Then the host said they had time for one more replay, a call from earlier in the night that had gotten cut off. My pulse started pounding in my ears. It was me again, but this time the call went further. I heard myself describing the weight of the truck, the way it pulled when I hit the brakes too hard, the exact model of the radio I was listening to. I heard myself say I had just delivered to a place near the edge of town, that I was heading back toward the highway. That was true. That was exactly where I was. I shouted at the radio, telling it to stop, telling myself this could not be real. My voice on the broadcast broke, and I heard myself say I should have taken the longer route, that the shortcut was a mistake. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over again, chest heaving. The call ended with me screaming, not words, just sound, and then silence. I sat there a long time, until my phone buzzed with a text from dispatch asking why I had stopped moving. I typed back that I felt sick and needed a minute. My hands were slick with sweat, and I wiped them on my jeans, leaving dark marks. I considered turning around, quitting the job on the spot, driving home and locking the door. But the radio host's calm voice echoed in my head, talking about reminders and safe driving, like this was all just a story meant to teach someone else a lesson. I decided to take the longer route back, the one that added time but avoided the curve. I told myself that if I changed the path, I would change the outcome. The radio stayed silent, blessedly quiet, and for a few miles my breathing evened out. I started to feel foolish, embarrassed by my own fear. Then the radio crackled, and my voice came on again, angry now, arguing with someone I could not hear. I was yelling about being rerouted, about a detour that was not marked. The words matched what I was thinking in that exact moment as I stared at an unlit junction I did not recognize. The broadcast ended with me saying I could still turn back, that it was not too late. I did turn back. I made a wide, clumsy turn, heart in my throat, and headed the way I had come. The road felt narrower, the darkness thicker, and I kept glancing at the radio like it might bite me. It stayed off. I laughed, a short, hysterical sound, and told myself I had beaten it, whatever it was. The crash still happened. It was not at the curve from the call. It was not dramatic. A deer stepped out where the road dipped, and I swerved, overcorrected, felt the truck tip and slide. The world tilted. then slammed back into place with a force that knocked the breath from me. The sound was exactly what I had heard on the radio earlier: metal tearing, glass shattering, my own voice screaming. When everything stopped moving, I sat there stunned, blood trickling down my forehead, engine ticking. I was alive. The truck was ruined, but I was alive. I fumbled for my phone with shaking fingers, dialing for help. As I waited for it to ring, the radio came on one last time. My voice played, calm and tired now, explaining the crash in detail, ending with me saying I would be okay, that I just needed someone to know what happened. The host thanked me and said the road remembers, even when we try to forget. Help came. I recovered. I quit that job and I do not drive at night anymore. I never heard my voice on the radio again, but I cannot listen to call-in shows without feeling sick. Sometimes, when I'm alone and it is quiet, I hear the echo of that broadcast in my head, and I know that somewhere, some version of me is still on that road, trying to warn himself. I was standing, ankle-deep in snow again, keys freezing into my palm, staring at that house like it had personally invited me just to humiliate me. I had shoveled it clear 3 days earlier. I knew because my shoulders still ached from it, and because I'd logged the maintenance time myself. Yet there it was, buried all over again, the drifts pushed neatly up against the siding, the porch steps erased, the front door reduced to a white vertical line like a headstone. I swore out loud, not dramatically, just tired and angry, and took another step forward, listening to the snow crunch in that way that tells you it's compacted by weight, not just falling. I remember thinking, very clearly, that it didn't feel cold enough for this. That thought sat there quietly while I dug my boot in and felt something firm beneath the snow, something pressed down hard, not frozen, but packed. A footprint. I stopped moving and stared at the ground, then used my glove to brush snow aside. The print was clean, heel to toe, pointed straight toward the house. I followed it with my eyes and saw another, then another, forming a line that led right up to the front door. No one lived there. I managed 12 rental properties in Joseph, mostly vacation homes. People came for the lake, the mountains, the quiet. This house was different. It had been vacant since before I took over the job, passed from one owner to another like a bad secret. The paperwork said, seasonal snow load issues, insurance disputes, nothing dramatic. Still, it was the only property that required weekly checks year-round. The only one the owners never wanted to sell. The only one where the snow never melted. I bent down and pressed my hand into one of the footprints. It wasn't icy. It was soft, like it had been made recently. I straightened up and felt that familiar professional irritation kick in. Someone was trespassing. Someone was messing with the property, maybe kids, maybe tourists. I pulled my phone out and snapped photos, narrating quietly for my own records, then trudged back to my truck. That night, at home, I couldn't stop thinking about the way the prints ended. They didn't come from the road. They started halfway across the yard, as if someone had just appeared there. I told myself it was drifting, wind, bad light. I went to bed repeating that until sleep finally took me. The next morning, my phone buzzed before sunrise. It was one of the neighbors near the property, an older man who called about everything. Snow on his fence, a light he didn't recognize. He said, "That house has tracks again." I didn't ask which house. When I got there, the snow was untouched, except for one set of footprints circling the building, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing. They didn't cross the yard this time. They just looped around the walls and stopped directly beneath the bedroom window. I stood there longer than I meant to, my breath fogging, my mind running through explanations that all felt thin. Animals didn't walk like that. Kids didn't pace, and nobody walked barefoot in snow, which I realized suddenly when I looked closer. The prints had toes. I didn't file a police report. I should have, but I didn't. I told myself I needed more information, that this was still just a property issue. I cleared the snow again, more thoroughly this time, scraping right down to the ground, marking the edges with small flags like I'd seen surveyors do. I locked every door, checked every window, and left. That night, I dreamed of walking in circles. On the third day, the flags were gone. Not knocked over. Removed, neatly stacked on the porch rail. The snow was back, deeper than before, sloping smoothly up the sides of the house like it was being tucked in. I felt something twist low in my stomach, a mix of anger and something closer to fear. I unlocked the front door for the first time since I'd taken the job. Inside, the house was dry and cold and perfectly ordinary. No footprints, no moisture. The air smelled faintly of old wood and dust. I walked through every room, narrating again, checking vents, crawl spaces, attic access. Everything was sealed. Everything made sense. Except the windows. Each one was fogged from the outside, opaque with frost, like someone had breathed on them and never wiped it away. I stood in the living room and pressed my palm to the glass. The frost didn't melt. That night, I set up a camera. It was a cheap, motion-activated thing I usually used to monitor vacant properties. I mounted it on a tree across the yard, angled toward the house, and tested it twice before leaving. I told myself I was being smart. Responsible, not scared. At 2:37 in the morning, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. Motion detected. I lay there for a full minute before picking it up. The thumbnail image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel. All I could see was snow, the white glow of the infrared making it look almost black. Then the video played. Something moved at the edge of the frame, slowly. Not stepping, not walking, pressing. The snow shifted downward, compressing under an invisible weight. Footprints appeared one by one, forming a path toward the house. I sat up so fast, I made myself dizzy. I watched until the path reached the front door. The camera clicked off. There were no figures. No bodies. Just the snow reacting, as if something heavy and careful was passing through it. I didn't go back to sleep. By the time the sun was up, I had convinced myself there was a technical explanation. Temperature differentials. Settling. Wildlife triggering the sensor. I drove out there with a thermos of coffee I never touched. The camera was gone, not broken. Not buried. Gone. The strap was still around the tree, cut cleanly. The snow beneath it was smooth and unmarked. I stood there shaking, not from cold, from the sudden, overwhelming certainty that this was no longer about a house. I called the owners that afternoon. For the first time, I didn't leave a message. I stayed on the line until someone answered. A woman, calm, distant. I told her everything. The snow. The footprints. The camera. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "We hoped it would wait." I asked what she meant. She asked how old I was. When I told her, she exhaled slowly and said, "That's later than usual." She told me the house had belonged to her family for generations, that it was built over something they never fully understood, something that drew heat out of the ground and left cold behind. That people who stayed there too long started walking at night, even in winter, even when they didn't remember leaving their beds. I asked her why they kept it. She said, because if no one watches it, it wanders. I went back one last time that evening. I don't know why. Some sense of responsibility, maybe. Or denial. The snow was falling everywhere else in town. Finally, a normal storm. But around that house, it fell thicker, heavier, as if pulled down faster. The footprints were already there, circling, overlapping now, dozens of paths worn into the yard. The snow didn't reach the road anymore. It stopped at the property line, piled high like a wall. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I stood at the edge and watched as the snow near the porch began to depress again, slowly, carefully, forming a shape that suggested shoulders, a head bowed low, as if whatever it was had learned how to stand. I spoke then, without planning to. I told it I was done, that I wouldn't come back, that it could have the house. The pressure eased. The shape collapsed inward, the snow settling back into itself. The next morning, the house was gone, not burned, not collapsed. Gone. The land was bare, damp earth steaming faintly, the snow around it untouched. There were no foundations, no debris. Just a rectangular patch where nothing would ever freeze again. I quit my job that week. I moved out of Joseph before winter ended. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up with the feeling of cold pressing down on my chest like weight without shape. But when I look outside, the snow is normal, and it stays where it falls. I was already rolling when the siren went off, hands tight on the steering wheel, heart kicking because that sound always meant somebody else's worst night had just started. I reached for the radio out of habit, expecting dispatch to crackle in with an address, but the channel stayed dead. The siren kept screaming anyway, long and steady, not the alert tone we used for calls. I slowed, looking at the empty street ahead of me, wondering if the system had glitched again. Then I realized something cold and precise. The sound wasn't coming from the station. It was coming from everywhere around my truck, matching my speed, rising and falling as I eased off the gas. I pulled over so fast the tires chirped. The siren cut off the exact second the truck stopped. My ears rang in the sudden quiet. I sat there, breathing hard, staring through the windshield. I told myself it was a coincidence. Some delayed relay or radio interference. I counted to 10 in my head. Nothing happened. I laughed once, sharp and stupid, and told myself to get home. The moment I shifted back into drive, the siren came back, same pitch, same volume, as if someone had flipped a switch connected directly to my foot. I said out loud, "That's not funny," even though no one could hear me. I drove a block, then 2, testing it. I sped up. The siren rose. I slowed. It fell. I stopped again, right in the middle of an intersection. Silence. A car waited behind me, the driver leaning on the horn. I waved him around, feeling ridiculous and suddenly exposed. When I moved again, the siren returned, and the other driver flinched, looking around like he was trying to locate a fire engine that wasn't there. By the time I reached the edge of town, my hands were shaking. I radioed the station, asked if anyone had triggered the alert. Static answered me. I tried dispatch again. Nothing. I turned the radio off, hoping that would help. It didn't. The siren wasn't coming through the speakers. It was outside, pressing in through the glass, vibrating the bones in my face. I knew that sound by heart. I'd heard it in my sleep, in grocery store aisles, in the middle of dinner. Hearing it when there was no call made my skin crawl. I told myself to drive straight to the station, but my turn came up before I could think it through. The road to my house peeled off to the right, narrow and dark, lined with trees that leaned too close. Without really deciding, I took it. The siren followed, obedient, like it had been waiting for that choice. As I passed the first mailbox, the sound dipped, then surged, a rhythm that matched the bumps in the road. I felt like I was being herded. Halfway home, I saw a porch light flick on ahead of me. Someone had heard it. I imagined doors opening, people stepping out, looking for smoke or flames. I wanted to stop, to explain, but I couldn't imagine how. Instead, I drove faster, shame and fear tangling in my chest. The siren grew louder, almost angry, until it felt like it was inside my head. When I finally pulled into my driveway and killed the engine, the siren stopped so cleanly it made my teeth ache. I sat there for a long minute, listening to my own breathing. My house looked normal, dark and quiet. I went inside, locked the door, and leaned my forehead against it. I told myself it was over. I made myself believe that. It wasn't. The next morning, I backed out of the driveway to go to work. The siren started the instant the truck rolled. I slammed on the brakes. Silence. My stomach dropped. I tried again. Siren. I didn't even bother swearing. I just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, feeling like I'd stepped into something I couldn't wipe off. I called the chief from my cell, told him something was wrong with the alert system, that it seemed tied to my truck. He laughed, asked if I'd been drinking already. I didn't laugh back. I drove to the station anyway, siren wailing the whole way. People pulled over, confused, some annoyed, some scared. When I stopped in the lot, it cut out. The chief was waiting, arms crossed. He said he hadn't logged any calls, said the system showed nothing unusual. He walked around my truck, checked under the hood, shrugged. "Probably a short," he said. "Get it looked at. We tested it." He stood outside while I rolled forward a few feet. The siren screamed. He stepped back like it had burned him. When I stopped, it stopped. He stared at me, then at the empty street beyond the fence. His face changed, not into fear exactly, but into something tight and thoughtful. He told me to shut the truck off and sit tight. He went inside and made some calls. By the time he came back, his voice was careful. He asked me if I'd ever heard of a man who used to volunteer years before I joined. I said no. He told me the man had died driving home from a call, lost control on that same road I lived on. The siren had stuck on during the crash, blaring until the engine finally died. Neighbors said it sounded like it was following him, right up to the end. I felt cold spread through my chest. I asked why he was telling me this now. The chief hesitated, then said, "The man had lived in my house. I didn't drive for 3 days. I walked to the store, to work, anywhere I needed to go. Every time I passed my truck, I felt watched. On the 4th day, the chief came by my house. He said they'd checked the system again. Nothing was wrong. He said maybe it was stress, maybe my mind had latched onto a story and run with it. He said the only way to know was to face it. That night, I got in the truck. I drove. The siren followed. I didn't stop. I drove the route the other man had taken, street by street, feeling the sound wrap around me like hands. When I reached the curve where he'd crashed, the siren changed. It softened, almost mournful. I pulled over, heart pounding, and for the first time, I spoke to the empty air. I said I knew. I said I was sorry. I said I would take the call if he let me. The siren faded, not all at once, but gently, like someone letting go. It never followed me again. I still hear it sometimes, in my head, but only when someone else needs help.